you, sir? How are you, sir? I want to introduce you to my mother. She surprised me by coming.
Wonderful to be here because when Aritra met me about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, and sort of gave me the book, I was fascinated because I didn't know where to start the book from, back to front or front to back, because it is, as he calls it, a visual novel, and I had never seen a visual novel in my life. And if you read the story, as I did a few weeks ago, it's fascinating because I've suggested to Aritra that he should have changed the name and called it Goliath of Shenzhen. And if he ever brings out a Bengali edition, that's what he should call it, because there are uncanny similarities between Shenzhen and Shenzhen. We of course won't go into who's the robot in the context of Bengal and who's the authoritarian Chinese army when it comes to Bengal, but we might well discuss that today. So many congratulations, Aritra, on the book. And I think before we start, we've got a small video that you want to give us a sense of what the book is and the entire concept of a visual novel. So we'll start with that and then get you maybe to give us some preliminary thoughts. Also, thank you very much to the Foreign Correspondents Club for having us here. That's great. So you've got it also on video. You don't just have it as a visual novel now in a book. But go ahead, Aritra, and tell us what made you sort of come up with the idea of a visual novel. Let's start with that.
Well, actually, the idea of the visual novel came about, subsequent to after I had actually written the novel itself. And I actually happened to see a copy of a magazine which I quite like called Men's Health. You know, it's a fitness magazine, fitness and lifestyle magazine, and they're quite innovative in the whole arena of publishing when it comes to integrating advertising. The way they did, I picked up an issue which also had a style guide for the Men's Health, and it was back to front. So if you read the main issue, then you had the regular features, and then if you turn the book around, then it had the style guide on the back. And that actually had given me an idea of how I could possibly integrate both a visual component to the book as well as the regular prose. But I had actually started working on the graphic novel after after working on the prose. And the main reason why I did that was that I was dealing with a very serious issue, the issue of land acquisition, of authoritarianism, of corruption. And these are quite heavy-duty issues. And I wanted to, and the way it's generally treated in the mainstream media, in both television, press, is generally for a very highbrow literary kind of an audience, a very scholarly kind of an audience. You'll see that these issues are generally written about at length in the editorial pages of the newspapers and in esteemed publications. But I felt that there's a need to actually bring some of these issues out to the general population. People who would perhaps be in the lifestyle pages, people who would, the youth, for example, and get them actually involved in social issues. Because I have a feeling that there's a huge need for this. I don't think in the media we are doing enough to get the younger generation involved in actual social change. I think there's a bit of sidelining that has been happening for a while, I think. And I think it's, if you speak to a lot of younger journalists, they will probably also tell you, that a lot of the times the ideas and viewpoints of the young, of the less influential, are not really captured within a democracy, And generally, it's the views and opinions of people who are at the top of the hierarchy, already, that tend to persist for long periods of time. And I think that is the fundamental root cause of why authoritarianism exists, is there isn't enough of a disruption of the ideas themselves, of how things should change, how things should be governed, continuously. So to give you an analogy, we lack, I think, in the whole political space or in the whole idea space, the equivalent of a startup ecosystem. A startup ecosystem which fundamentally means that anyone could come in, anyone could come up with ideas, there'd be experimentation, there'd be discussions, there'd be all kinds of collaboration. I think that intellectual ferment is missing today in the world. And I think the reason why it's missing is because the youth, and I think even like I would say, non-established individual, let's call it this way, people who are not necessarily, part of the elite, they might be minorities, they might be women, they are not really included, I think, in the debate of what it means to actually have a functioning democracy, And my whole approach was to try and get new types of audiences into this whole debate. And that's why I did the graphic novel, the visual novel, in a way to, without corrupting the overall essence of the idea, but how could I actually bring in the newer audiences to start seeing and really believing in this mission.
For those who haven't read the book, it's set in China, in a village there, which is to be taken over by the army and by the Chinese government to build an auto plants that they want. And the villagers then come together and eventually find a robot which is used then to take on the army. And it's sort of a battle from below, constantly innovating, finding ways in which you can challenge the political and the military leadership of China. I must confess the analogy to Bengal was irresistible, because it almost seemed as if you had witnessed what had happened in Shingur in particular and decided that maybe that might be too much of a risk to take to sort of make it a book about Bengal. So why don't I make it a book about China instead? But every Bengali or anyone certainly who lives in Kolkata will have a strong sense of affinity with the subject. Was that deliberate? Was that something that agitated you at the time when it was happening? And did that in any way have an impact on this theme that you chose? Is the Chinese army in a way the left? And are those villagers who come together essentially possibly Trinamool political activists?
Well, actually, to be honest with you, the analogy, I think, came more organically. It wasn't deliberate, to be fair with you. But yes, I mean, there are certain phenomenon things in Bengal which I think lends itself better to a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach, I think. The essential reason why I think what I was actually trying to say is I think that around the world, the bottom-up democracy is beginning to fail. At least it is now being replaced by authoritarianism around the world. And this, I think, is the biggest. I was seeing this issue 3-4 years ago as it was happening. I was seeing the undercurrents that were being shaped globally. And I predicted that we would arrive at a time in India where people would hanker for authoritarianism. And I think this was essentially the worry or the fear with which I actually approached this particular project. Is
We have an authoritarian leader in this country?
I believe that we have an authoritarian system. I think, we do have, of course, the leaders are authoritarian. They sometimes appear to be, not appear to be. I mean, I wouldn't go into specific characterizations, but I mean, we know the true picture. The system, however, is what I'm actually more concerned about. And by the system, I mean this entire set of rules which governs our country, for example, the entire system. The fact is that, there is an inherent streak within our country for authoritarianism. And I think more importantly, there's an inherent streak in most democracies also, not just in India, but if you go to United States, if you go to UK, there is a general tendency for people to, I think, choose authoritarianism. And the question which disturbs me is why? Why are people so willing to, ignore the very tools which they are blessed with as a democracy? Or why is it that these tools are not being used properly? And I actually, wrote the book where I think I was able to identify the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that, within a collective, and you look at any society, any group of people, there is no efficient way of building a consensus. So let's say if there's a group of 3 or 4. How does that group of 3 or 4 come to a decision and move forward? The problem generally starts from there. And what I actually realized was that there is really no efficient way for the individual voices to be heard by everyone within that group, and also for those voices to be assessed in terms of quality. So because you have this entire thing missing, what you're lacking within a democratic framework is an inefficient process at building a consensus to begin with.
But it seems to me that your answer or your solution to that is what you call bottom-up democracy, that you then have individuals who come together using their imagination, their ingenuity, and build a consensus. Are able. So that's the fascinating part of it. That you've got these villagers, anonymous, faceless in a way villagers, who, in the face of the mighty Chinese army, find their way of combating it. So are you saying that is the way to challenge authoritarian regimes, is to create this notion of a bottom-up democracy of individuals who may just use their ingenuity to find almost guerrilla-like. Your sort of protagonists are almost guerrilla-like in the way they steal arms, build the robot. Is that what you see is the way to counter authoritarianism?
So I won't go into the specific actions and the morality of those actions themselves, but I'm just talking about the process. The general process, I do believe, has to be something which is united, which unites people rather than divides people. So at the core of it, what you need is a sense of purpose. And generally what is, I think, missing in most countries today or most societies is this general sense of purpose that is shared across the collective, because there's no vision. You really talk to any world leader today, what's the vision for your country 5 years down the road? You can talk to a CEO, for example, of Apple, and they would tell you, this is my vision over the next 5 years. But that same approach does not apply for countries, for democracies. And that is where it's failing fundamentally. There is no general sense of purpose, so you are not really having a situation where people are united and moving forward in concert together, And in this particular novel, I shared a case where people would actually unite around a common theme, around a common purpose of actually saving their village from being taken over. So then what they did was they actually they came together, but they didn't come together simply because generally what happens is in most movements when people come together, the views of 1 or 2 people generally tend to dominate, and then those people become authoritarian. And then the system, actually the cycle continues even when a revolution happens and the next party comes to power. The same process actually continues. You saw for example, in the Middle East, You know, you had one government, let's say, for example, in Egypt, go out, and then another one comes in, the Muslim Brotherhood, and then that party is also thrown out. The next guy comes in, so it seems to repeat the cycle. And
it's true in Bengal also, left authoritarianism replaced by Mamta's authoritarianism.
So the problem
Sorry to keep you getting you back to Bengal, because the similarities are uncanny, but go ahead.
But the problem is the system itself. Why isn't it that you are having a lasting change? And what would it take to bring about a lasting change? Is somehow a method in which every citizen's voice can be recorded and assessed, which actually means that I think the age of direct democracy rather than representative democracy, which is what actually all democracies today are functioning on the concept of representative democracy. We elect a certain number of, certain groups of people or certain people in positions of power to handle our interests, you know. At the end of the day, we give them 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, whatever it is, to exercise that mandate. Then what happens? Then we see how they've done, and then we kick out and we bring in the next lot of people. But the problem is that in between what happens is we don't have enough control or enough say in what happens in between. You know, so at each level there needs to be a way in which I think direct democracy works. And I don't think that's been invented yet. But I think in the age of technology, you need to have new kinds of inclusive methods. Using technology that enables citizens to start contributing to these issues at the touch of a mobile app, for example.
But are you being overly idealistic in the belief that the powerful Chinese army, this authoritarian state, can be sort of defeated or challenged by a group of villagers? Do you believe that that's actually possible in the real world, or is this your hope and a dream that you're sort of throwing at people?
No, it is definitely a dream, but I'll tell you, I believe it's possible because I think an idea is more powerful than any number of people. Fundamentally, if there is a powerful idea there, then if there is a means to disseminate that idea across the broader collective, then I think change can happen. You know, but if the idea itself is blocked in some way, you know, is castrated, so as to speak, then it never reaches the people at large, and there is no debate that follows. As a concept.
You know, it's interesting because in India you've had over the years, let's say the anti-corruption movement, in the Anna Hazare movement, which was again initially seen as a group of faceless activists, bottom-up democracy, but the moment they entered elections, they then just became like any other political party. So I just wonder, you know, let's assume that these 5 villagers or a group of villagers, D and the others, if they were ever to get into participatory democracy, would they just become like any other political force? Is it important to sort of retain the sort of innocence and the romance of being able to take on the powerful for these movements to endure?
So it's more about a new concept which actually, which people don't talk about. It's the concept of openness, fundamentally. You know, I think the more important issue is for some of these movements, if they have to persist, like in this case, you know, the movement that we're saying, is that they actually were successful because they were open to ideas coming from anywhere. Mm-hmm. At the core of it, they were open to voices from outside coming in. And that is where I think the real change is happening. Because most groups are very comfortable with listening to a certain number of voices that they already know. You know, it might be, let's say, someone whom I trust and respect personally, as someone at the top. And so you're not even bothering to look at ideas or viewpoints of other people, you know. So I think that is where, I think if that process becomes institutionalized, right, then I think it can actually work in the longer run. But there is no way currently in democracy, modern democracy, anywhere in the world, you know, to institutionalize this, because politicians fundamentally do not trust the people at large. Let's be very frank, you know. And they do not actually, they look at the people in a sense as an instrument to ascend power. And this is not just here, it's everywhere. The fact is that there needs to be a better connect between the people and the democratic process beyond just the one-off election.
And you know, the villagers do have a leadership in a sense. You know, the character that you have, D, is essentially a leader, an inspirational figure who through the movement in a sense changes himself, because he also realizes the importance of embracing other people's views and building the sense of a community. So I'm presuming even you accept that to challenge these authoritarian forces, A, you need a leader, and B, you need a leader who's willing to build communities rather than believe in himself alone.
Absolutely. I think the fact is that, there's a conflict which arises in us from the day we are born, which is the split between the idea of the individual and the collective. So we do not embrace the greater good as something which should, support and sustain our lives. We are very happy with simply living for ourselves. And I think when those people actually sacrifice self-interest in favor of the larger good, favor of the greater good, and they are consistent with it, that's when you can actually get real change, particularly when that person is able to percolate the values down the system.
One of those values is creativity. It's the ability to be a creative disruptor, in a sense where you started off that you need to challenge authoritarianism, you need some kind of a startup culture.
Correct.
I mean, it's almost like, if Rahul Gandhi had to be provided a recipe as to how he's going to challenge the powerful forces that are ranged against him, he would have to, in a way, build a new narrative, come up with more ingenious ways of actually challenging the system from below. But, I mean, the political analogies apart, I come back to where I started. Why did you decide to choose China as the place where you wanted to locate this book? I mean, could this book not have been located in some other part of the world, or maybe a part which would have even had greater affinity maybe to India? I mean, land acquisition is a huge issue in this country as well. You could well have had a group of Adivasi villagers in Chhattisgarh who are challenging their government, or in Jharkhand. Why did you choose necessarily China?
Well, the thing is that, the whole book is about how to bring about change in the right way, which is what we're talking about, this entire bottom-up collaborative approach. The fact is that in order to show this happening, so this was a question that I was trying to investigate. In order to show that happening, I needed to create an authoritarian kind of an enemy in that sense. And I actually felt that the enemies in India are more devious in that sense. I mean, it's not so easily labeled in that point of view, But it was easier for me to actually, in that sense, because the Chinese case is quite stark, because, the authoritarianism is very, very stark, at least when it comes to expression, and I felt that it was easier it was logical actually to kind of frame it within that environment of authoritarianism, but also a place which has embraced modernity in terms of technology, which the Chinese have in a big way. Their industrial progress has been tremendous, to say the least, at least in terms of hardware and things that they build. And it was important for me to create an environment like that, where there's authoritarianism and yet at the same time there's a high level of technological advancement. And I couldn't really see any other alternative to China. India still, I think, is, I would say, compared to China, India is authoritarian in a different way, perhaps not at the level of the state, but more in terms of a lot of other ancillary players that come in and create a sense of control.
Are you therefore saying that in the Chinese context, it's easier to decide who's the villain and who's the so-called heroes? In India, on the other hand, it's more complex. And in that sense, perhaps in India, it's more difficult to defeat the villains. Because the villains can one day be Ravan and next day claim to be Ram. The same individual can play both roles. And, we may well find ourselves being, in a way, is it more difficult in a sense for a writer to try and sort of through imagination create a similar situation in a more complex society like India?
So I would actually say India by itself, India is a very complex concept. As in, India is not really a nation as such. If you really see India's, I still feel it's a amalgamation of many cultures and many nations within India. So in a sense, you might actually ask this question in the case of West Bengal. And you might get one answer. You might ask this question in Rajasthan and you might get an entirely different answer, So, but China is more homogeneous. It's more like, it's like a state, it's a large state of India from that point of view, It would be similarly difficult to also ask this question in Europe, if I think about it this way, where there's so much diversity across Europe. So India tends to be more like Europe, I think, less like China.
And the decision in your book to use the robot as the instrument who's going to challenge the army. Is that your belief that technology is the way to, in a way, challenge established leaderships or established systems? That, that is one of the weapons, in a way, that the small man has against the big man.
So the small man, unfortunately, doesn't have technology, to that level yet. But what the small man, everyone has, is a mind, fundamentally, and a mind which, when is connected to the internet and to the world of open knowledge, in theory, and also when it is paired with, like-minded people through social media and stuff like that, can actually create a tremendous revolution, I believe, which I don't think we've seen yet. And this sort of foreshadows something which is possible. We don't really have, for example, that type of connectivity yet. We are connected in social media, but are we connected to the right people? Are we connected to the people who share our interests, who maybe can contribute innovatively? Are you able to collaborate so efficiently? Not yet. But I think the time is coming very soon when that will happen. And when that will happen, then you're going to see a total groundswell. It's going to be very difficult then to stop innovation.
It's interesting the way you're putting it, because it almost seems then that you could create a WhatsApp revolution in this country, as some believe, connect communities through WhatsApp, and then build a challenge to, let's say, someone who's seen as a dictator or a tyrant in any system. Do you believe that that's going to be the future? That in future, if civil society, in a way, if I may use the word, is going to challenge the state, it's going to have to use technology, easily accessible technology, to challenge the state.
So it needs to use, I would say, technology, yes, but technology, you have to understand, is simply a device. It's a tool. It by itself, it's brain dead. You need a certain level of brain or imagination on top of the technology to actually give it that sense of heart, that sense of spirit, And actually, to be honest with you, I would say the real gap today is the fact that the technologists of today aren't really engaged in the political process or aren't engaged in fundamental issues of human life as yet. So a WhatsApp, for example, a WhatsApp is very content in letting you express and communicate, but is not interested in helping you to start a political movement. It's not interested in helping you to build a business, for example. It's not looking at that because that's not really the interests of the founders of WhatsApp. But the minute you have new types of founders coming in, for example, if you have, let's say, media guys coming into technology, who have, tremendous interest in social issues, you have artists and writers coming into technology, then you will find a lot of amalgamation of new concepts coming in, and therefore new types of products.
In your book also, you sense the emotional anxieties, the challenges, the doubts. There's a lot of self-doubts that people have, and they're wrestling with this constantly. The villagers have to, their relationships are very poignant, versus a state which seems to be almost like an abstract state. I mean, you don't really define the characters of the state. You choose to focus instead. Your characters are based in the local village. It's not the army. The army is just this sort of, there are no individuals there representing. Is that again something that that how you see the world? That those who are part of the state are in a sense faceless.
Absolutely.
And the human sort of soul, in a way, lies in civil society.
That is absolutely correct, Rajdeep. I think this is where we have come. I mean, this is not what society was. I think, at least this is not what things were like, during the Second World War, or, from what I've heard, the powers were more connected to the people from that point of view. But I think over the years, it's become distant to the point where now I think it's the greatest distance, I think, in history, in a time of tremendous connectedness. But the fact is, the problem is that no one trusts each other. The human trust is at an abysmally low level. And that's giving also, giving the political class and the authorities sort of the power to, to divide and to perpetuate themselves, in a manner of speaking. Because they are not interested in fundamentally changing the system as such. Because if you really think about it, if I were to flip the question this way, is that, for example, if you had a leader, world leader, who actually thought like a CEO, then his or her entire mindset would be, how do I build things? How do I create a new type of an education system? How do I create a new kind of healthcare system? Do you find these debates happening today in society anywhere in the world? What you find is essentially reactions, reactions to what some other guy has said or some other party has said. It's just, criticisms and allegations, but no new ideas per se. Because fundamentally that's not the orientation. You need different minds coming in to this entire space.
The world's most powerful democracy is ruled by a CEO at the moment, who keeps throwing up all kinds of ideas. So authoritarianism can come in various forms. It doesn't have to come through the army itself. Yeah. It could come through individuals. It could come through the political democratic system.
Yes.
It could come through president. So, I mean, do you see hope? You leave the novel at the end with a sort of sense of ambivalence as to how hopeful you are. Is this simply one localized movement that has ventured into the unknown, as you call it? Or do you believe that across the world you will see at some stage more and more such small movements coming to challenge the established autocratic leaderships?
Yes. So it's not only the political process, not only the political system, but I think in any collective or any organizational setup, it could be a company, it could be even within a family, for example. These are all examples of collective, different types of collectives. That change needs to come up in a very, things need to be happening in a very transparent way, fundamentally. That's what I believe in. And I think at the ending of the book here, you're right, the ambivalence is the fact that, and partly that's also due to literary effect, didn't want to make it too predictable as well. But I think it was important to show that, that there were problems with this entire approach, that it wasn't entirely without, errors. And the main problem was that there was no clarity of mission. So at one point, the focus was on freeing the village. Then, then later on, it became about, let's go and free China. So it kept shifting, allegiances. And I think one of the characters caught this. But at the end, because that clarity of vision was not there in the beginning, and that's what led a few people to get disconnected from it. And therefore, I think, put the spanner in the works, and ultimately it didn't work out. But on the other hand, also, the creative approach that of building the robot itself was so, because it had the ideas of everyone in place, was a very sound concept in itself. And so that withstood, essentially, all the firepower of the military army, because it was designed to capture all these different inputs coming in from people. And
I want to open it up to questions, because there are people here who sort of, the Foreign Correspondents Club, in a sense, will have people who probably travel to China and India. But I want to ask you this: if you had to lead a revolution or encourage people to lead a revolution, would you be happier having that happening in China, or would you be happier having that closer home?
Well, I think, to be honest with you, it doesn't really matter to me where it happens. But
you don't think nation-state boundaries matter at all?
I think we must look at the world as a borderless world. I think fundamentally, we must move beyond this nation-state thinking, which is also, I think, a result of the entire political process. Why do we think of nation-state as a concept? Rather, let's think of even city-states. That might be better, because in a city-state model, what happens is you have so many different types of people congregating, right? The ethnic identity is less important. What matters is what you do, So I fundamentally believe in a meritocratic revolution in that sense. And I think that will happen when innovation comes at the core of society. And ethnic identity, or identity as such, becomes more about what you can do rather than where you're from.
Fascinating. Let me throw that to the audience. Some of you who may have read the book, some of you may not have, and throw this idea that, do you really believe? Why, you come from a part of the world where there's so much of talk of revolution from below. Does that actually work? Has that actually worked? Or, as Aritra himself points out, it might only lead to one sort of autocratic leadership replacing another. Is that the danger of sort of, when you try and mobilize people around an inspirational leader to challenge the established systems?
I think what interests me in the book, I have read it, and what interests me is the discussion, because he enriched it in the discussion more than in the book. And he left the part of the imagination to us to put up all this, to be part of the robot making. And I just was, puzzled by the builder of the robot and the people of the land. Is it? I mean, at the end of the day, it's a fight between a democratic system for human-made mankind and a machine, which is developed into a kind of a robot. But there is also forces behind this to develop. So, is that kind of social transformation can help in democratic setup society to strengthen this kind of a robot or a giant that he can take over and really implement what the grassroots have come up with. Because you brought the Egyptian example, you brought the Bengal example, the system is the same. Just faces have changed. But there, where does the innovations really of inventing something in a mankind revolution rather than a machine-led society?
So it's more about, it's more about actually innovation fundamentally. And I think we don't really understand beyond the technology industry and advertising. These are two industries which have really been really transformed through innovation fundamentally. I don't think, as a general society, we really understand what it means to be innovative and what innovation means. And I think this needs to probably start from, from childhood through the education system, get people, I think, going there. And then I think you will understand exactly what this is, because then it really is about taking people away from this baggage which they're born with and giving them a new set of tools which they can actually harness through their mind, and through their soul, and actually then end up, really leveling or really ending all these problems, once and for all, through collaboration. Because, most of the times you might have an idea, someone else builds on it, that's the way it works, and then someone else might come up with something. So when you have that kind of a ecosystem working across society as a whole, that's when I think change will happen. And it's not really about, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what the political system is. Whatever the political system, it could even be a dictatorship in theory, but a dictatorship which allows this openness to exist.
Yeah, go ahead. First here and then Sankarshan.
Listen, I was just curious. Did you follow the Tiananmen Square movement in China before you wrote the book?
To be honest with you, of course, I've had, I've read up about it, but not particularly, not thoroughly researched it by any stretch of the imagination.
The reason I'm curious is that I was in China just 6 months before Tiananmen Square happened. And there was no digital revolution at that time. There were no cell phones, there was no WhatsApp, whatever. But I could still hear, see, feel, and actually write about the murmurs of that change, of that revolution which was coming. It was a very small movement that came and died, but it was happening even then. So I'm just curious, why didn't you follow that? Or you were just basically, like you said, only wanted to sort of pen down a change that you want to see in the world?
Well, it was more a philosophical question, not so much a historical question. It's more a question of how do you actually bring about sustainable change. This entire problem, which Dr. Awad has said, is you change, the faces change, but the system remains the same. So that was the problem that was a question I was trying to answer. What would it take to bring about lasting change? So China, in a sense, became incidental. And in the past also, whatever happened in the past also in some way also was only relevant as far as this character development was concerned, But in the greater scheme of things, this story did not require that kind of an in-depth analysis. It's not a historical novel, from that point of view. That's where I was coming from.
I've actually found some of the exchanges this evening on particularly the technology human interface quite fascinating and thought-provoking. Some of this I can talk to with Aritra later. But what I wanted to ask you was, you spoke about meritocracy. Will not that become its own dictatorship, especially when you're talking about societies like India, where merit is in very, very short supply, and you talk of a meritocracy, then it becomes its own kind of dictatorship.
Well, I'll tell you what. The fact is, what I'm actually saying is that no one decides who is good, fundamentally, other than the market as a whole, if I really look at it this way, So the problem is, even if you look at, say, America, which is the land of meritocracy, actually there isn't pure meritocracy there. It's decided by... So pure meritocracy is something which you and I have not seen before. And I believe that the only way that can happen is through a digital revolution, because the digital revolution is the only way in which you can actually bring the contributions of everyone into an open space, so that there is no subversion. You have to prevent subversion, essentially, which actually creates cliques, which creates, biases that ultimately destroys meritocracy. So to give you an idea, let's say, say how do newspapers decide what articles to be published? So generally what happens is, certain columnists are given, guaranteed space because of reputation. But it could well be that some field report on that specific topic, if it were open, could have actually generated a better story. But we do not have a dynamic system which continuously, gets all these contributions and assesses them by giving everyone the space to assess them. Generally, the assessment is done by editors or by elites up there in the top. You do not have the market forces actually coming in most of the cases, because actually the elite structures, by and large, are suspicious of the market forces, I find, for the most part, And that's where I think, we, in this book challenges this specific idea, is do we actually need elites in that sense of the word? Rather, we need inspirational people who can lead. But as far as curation, as far as all those things are concerned, that can well be done by the market in an efficient way. So why get into that?
There's another question, and you raise it as one of the most fundamental questions. In fact, you say the biggest question of all, however, is the most fundamental. Is freedom a necessary precondition to happiness? Are free societies happier societies? Is this particular village happier today because it sort of challenged the army, even if it didn't achieve sort of full victory over it? Is it a happier place simply because it's gone through the process of challenging these autocratic leaderships? People often say, are the Chinese actually happier than Indians? Because they've got, they seem to be, by all accounts, economically far better off than us. And, maybe they don't have the freedom of speech that we Indians claim that we have. But are they happier than us? So this notion of happiness, yes. This journey, it almost sounds then that you're being philosophical about it, that it's the journey that matters, the process that matters, not necessarily the eventual result. And therefore, even if I don't eventually get the freedom that I want, the fact that I've gone through the process should make me feel happier about life. Elaborate on that. Do you believe that, happiness is to be defined by the search for freedom?
So it's a quest, I believe. Fundamentally, I mean, this is, again, I think there are lots of people who've written about it. So I'm probably just the, N+1th person who's maybe given his 2 bits. But what I actually believe that, we have been taught from, I would say conditioned by various, various forces, education system to really go after certain objects. So those objects are wealth, status, glory, it could be let's say a nice job, cushy job, etc. So largely I would call it as specific attainments, material and non-material. And these objects have basically been, been the target, and we've been told to go after these. Now, the fact is that it might always happen that if you actually do achieve these, you end up not feeling happy because you may not have gone about it the right way. Of course, if you've gone about it the right way and you've achieved it, that's one thing, But if you haven't gone about it the right way, which means that you have broken the rules in a lot of cases, your own rules. I'm not talking about necessarily society's rules, but your own personal rules that you have set for yourself, you've broken them. How would you feel at the end of the day? Would you actually, sleep well at night? That's the whole question, that's the test I say. How do you sleep well at night? At the end of the day, I think that's what really matters, is to go to bed after a long day, and really actually be happy that you've done a great job.
No, but the freedom, the notion of freedom.
Yes.
The notion that unless I'm free, I can't be truly happy. Do you believe that societies which are free in the modern sense, societies which are, where people have the right to free speech, societies where you have a right to sort of move across from city to town without worrying about who's going to stop you, societies where land acquisition can't be done by diktat. Right. Are those societies happier? In your view, is that what the Chinese or any world community should be aiming for?
So let's put it this way: freedom is what I'm calling it as a hygiene factor. I think what I'm actually trying to say is that without freedom, it's almost impossible to find happiness. Because you probably will be under the beck and call or control of someone else, and if you're conscious, that is not going to be acceptable. You might be comfortable and might justify and delude yourself that it is a okay situation, but I don't think you will ever be happy being under the beck and call of someone else, losing your autonomy in a true sense. So I meant by precondition as a necessary condition, but it is not a sufficient condition, which means that there are other things required apart from that in order to make you happy. And one of the biggest things which is required, I believe, or one of the biggest things is the whole idea of being able to bond fundamentally, bond freely with the fellow human being. And even with freedom, there could be walls that exist between people. Like I'll give an example. Scandinavian societies score very high on the happiness indices, compared to any countries in the world. We all know that, right? But if you look at their levels of isolation, for example, the human isolation and the relationship aspect is very, very poor. The isolation levels are very, very high over there. And that actually suggests to me that they are suppressing a lot of truths when it comes to their overall happiness by dismissing this part or not really divulging this part. So I think the whole idea of socializing in a broader sense, mixing with people and bonding with people is also important, and the two need to coexist, and that's the important thing. So you need a situation where you build trust across society, and also you're able to actualize whatever you want to do through the freedom. When these two things come together, I think then you can really, create a wonderfully progressive and prosperous society.
Let me get if there's anyone else who has a question. Yeah, go ahead.
I just have a curious comment. 20 years ago when there was no digital revolution, you wouldn't have written the book, right?
Well, to be honest with you, I don't know how far my imagination would stretch, but to be honest with you, the world was a different place 20 years ago for sure, and I think it was a more optimistic place as far as I remember, as going to college. Everyone had very big dreams in the mid-90s and everyone was going after it. I think things pushed back after 9/11 fundamentally, After 9/11, I think the world went into over-control, hyper-control mode and excessive security. And then I think the financial crisis took it to another level. I don't think we've really recovered from there. We need to, rediscover the optimism of the 90s and actually build on it going forward, I think there is a need for a change in the global dynamic itself,
What I was trying to get at, Aritra, was that, authoritarianism and dictatorship has been around forever. It existed in times, way back, and it's existed through the ages. So the reason, what appealed and motivated you, I'm trying to get at, is the whole fact that there is an instrument that can be used, whether it's the digital revolution or it's the innovation in the digital revolution, so to say, as you've emphasized. And I think what you're laying stress on is innovation.
Yes.
More than just the digital revolution.
Correct.
And it's without innovation, all this would not be possible. So some innovative mind may not be the best IQ in the world, but decides and looks for this quest, as you say, for freedom, and uses this instruments to today be able to challenge authoritarianism. And that's something that you want to profess and push.
So you will always have tools in every generation. At every point of time, there will always be technology, something or the other which will always be there. Today we have social media, and 10 years from now you'll have artificial intelligence, virtual reality. That will give it a whole dimension. But at the same time, you'll also have controls, and those controls might actually grow faster than the technology itself and prevent you from really using this in a way that is progressive, and if you really see over the last 15, 20 years, the controls, I believe, have grown faster than technology. I think we all agree with that. Not everywhere. Even America, look at financial, look at how the financial system has become regulated, under Obama was horrendous, absolutely. No one could, I have so many friends there. Not that I'm a big fan of that entire, sector, but still, nonetheless, the kind of crazy regulations which prevented people from doing business, and those have grown. So we need to move towards a less regulatory environment overall. But what I mean is that also an environment where transparency is there, which is missing right now.
The last comment, I take that risk is if, your book would be probably seen by the establishment everywhere as inciting, fomenting revolutions.
Which is why you've got to spread this book across. You've got to translate it into Bengali and send it across Bengal and different parts of anywhere where you see authoritarian regimes. Make sure your book is there and it's translated into those languages, Aritra, to give people the hope that they can challenge authoritarianism. But let's get one last question. Yes.
It's very interesting that a democracy app sort of thing. Would you foresee in future, like we have this Sensex going on the Bombay Stock Exchange, can we have a kind of democracy index at the top of Election Commission of India?
Not just an NRS. You need to have so it needs to be a contributory thing, So, you should have a lot of these things coming up in real time, You should be able to contribute in real time. You should be able to also have discussions across a wider society on those special interests. Otherwise, how will these issues itself create awareness? So part of the problem is that people aren't aware of a lot of these issues. We have a certain number of people who end up hijacking the debate. We know how that happens, right? Now, the question is, you need a way in which you include and start disseminating, including everyone. And I think there's no option but digital in this case. It's really...
And I think because you've done a visual novel, I would recommend it highly to sort of that you send it to, 11th standard, 12th standard students. Those are, that should be your target audience. These are people who don't read enough at the moment. And the way you've written it, it's shorter than the usual, long novel. And I think, it should be something that you should explore.
The barrier, Rajdeep, is actually the fact that the youth today are being conditioned not to question. That is the biggest worry that's happening today. They are more conditioned to follow than ever before. And the social media is creating this momentum as well, which is sort of pushing them down a bandwagon.
No, or the youth will tell you, please reduce your novel to 140 characters and tell us the 10 main points and do a BuzzFeed around it. I mean, that's my other big worry. Even though, I think what you really should do, when I was reading it a few weeks ago, was that there was a movie there. There's a great movie to be made about, people who challenge the system, use the robot. There's a lot of imagination that you've used. So there is every possibility of finding a more visual way, perhaps, of attracting the younger people.
So the whole concept actually not just applies to to a political revolution, but today they built a robot. Tomorrow, any problem could find a solution collaboratively. So it could be, let's say, if someone wants to build an auditorium, for example, over here, a new projection system. You get the ideas from the people, and then you can do it collaboratively. That's the whole point of it. Revolution is just one example.
Which is why the FCC has done a better job than the press club in building an auditorium, because the press club does nothing by collaboration. Yeah. So if things were done by collaboration, you could do what Venkat and Weil and all have done. But you have a final word.
I just, on a lighter note, you used also the magician's word, hocus pocus mocus, which has brought to my notice you from Bengal, and we used to be in the children. And when you used to have a magician in my country, and he used to use hocus pocus, filukus, shakalai, makalai. So that magician word, you have been using it in the villager's mind. In the book, you have used those terms. But that you can give me the answer for it. But my question here is a political, a little bit in the political line. Being a Bengali, do you foresee a kind of a conflict in the future between China and India? Like we in the center differ from your point of view. Can you elaborate to us on this point?
So on the India-China conflict, see, it's very difficult to see where it will escalate, honestly. They are escalating now, but it might be a function of leaderships that are existing currently that, choose to escalate the issue, with a different leadership, things might change. So I'm not so worried about the India-China axis. I don't think there's going to be major large-scale conflict that will happen because there's too much at stake. between, for both the, for both the countries. But I wanted to actually, talk about, just bring up one point about the magic element is, in this book, so I sort of used a lot of literary techniques because I actually believe in, being from a publishing background, I do believe in the power of literature, which I think, over the years, I think has lost its luster. In the age of digital, I think we don't really talk about literature of today. And that's also a deep passion area is, I do want this book to be perceived as a work of literature in a sense, because what I'm trying to do is bring about a human change, a social change. And I do believe that literature used to do that. And for, I think, the world to change, literature must actually come and make a change. And I've got a short video, which I would love to share you, on how literature can actually bring about social change. And that could actually then inspire technology in the future, rather than, from technology onwards.
Are you going to put it on? Is that correct?
Yes.
When a boy in college is made to go around the campus with fairness cream all over his face just because he's dark-skinned, I feel sorry.
When there's someone dying in the ambulance and the traffic is held up for a VVIP's convoy to pass, I feel sorry.
When some ridiculous men find it amusing to pat the rare side of a female colleague, I feel sorry.
When a young man is disowned by his family and friends for loving another young man, I feel sorry.
For the wrongdoings of a handful of bad guys, when people of an entire community are barred from entering clubs, restaurants, movie theaters,
now even countries. We feel sorry.
when a bright, deserving lady is denied her promotion just because she's pregnant, I feel sorry.
When an employee for 20 years is fired because the young new boss thinks you can't teach old dogs new tricks, I feel sorry.
When a woman is madly assaulted by her husband for not making love in bed the way he wants her to, I feel sorry.
Feeling sorry is same as accepting discrimination. Raise your voice, write about it. Join the Literature for Change movement. Collectively, let's bring the end to discrimination.
That's very good.
They need, I think literature, in my opinion, is sort of like this ignored, neglected sort of person out there, because there's so much information out there. The power of the word, the power, not just the power of the imagination to really uplift people's hearts and minds, that I think needs to come back fundamentally. That's what we are really trying to do, I think, And I mean, there's so many journalists, that say work over here, so many writers, they are not able to really, tell the stories which really matter, at the end of the day, from their heart,
So are you ready to provide that platform to them?
Absolutely.
Because
Absolutely.
I will make one final suggestion to you before we end, is that the Kolkata Book Fair will be probably sometime in January.
Yes.
And by then you should have this book translated certainly into your mother tongue, because I think it will be the kind of book that will resonate among people who will want, who are looking for answers in a way to the solutions of to the problems of our times. So many congratulations, Aritra, for actually using a format to innovatively challenge established ways of both literature with the visual novel, as well as, challenging society in a way to think and innovate and accept that and realize that the status quo is simply not good enough.
I think that's what.
So,
that's all I've tried to do.
So well done. I think he deserves a very big hand for really having made that effort. And I really do hope, I honestly do hope that you take it into regional languages, because I think that's where, again, there's a huge hunger for information and where you can actually bring about change.
Yes. And I think the storytelling as well, I think that which used to exist in India 2,000 years ago, I think we need to start actually a storytelling movement. I think that's
wonderful.
where we start.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.